Welcome everybody to Learn to Read Knitting Patterns. My name is Dana and I am the editor of Fave Crafts and I will be emceeing today's class. If you aren't familiar with Fave Crafts, we're a website that shares free craft tutorials from all over the internet. We have a wide variety of free email newsletters broken down by interest like Easy Does Knit, Everyday Crochet, and more. And you can sign up for any of our free newsletters at favecrafts.com. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the class and I will be emailing out the copy of that recording tomorrow in about 24 hours. So keep an eye on your email for that. And it will be posted to our YouTube channel as well. You can use the Q&A feature or the chat to ask questions. I'll be gathering those questions over the course of the webinar and we're going to save them for the end. So stick around to have your questions answered. And that's it for housekeeping. I want to thank today's sponsor and introduce Hortense from Knitting with Chopsticks. Hortense is the designer behind Knitting with Chopsticks. Knitting with Chopsticks was created as a way to give back and share easy knitting patterns and crochet patterns with beginners everywhere. Hortense's goal is to break down patterns so they're simple enough for you to create exactly what you want, the way you want it. She's an engineer by trade and a crafter by passion, which means all of her patterns have an extreme attention to detail, thorough explanations, and step-by-step pictures. When she's not working on a yarn project, you might find her diving at the beach or rewatching Grey's Anatomy for the 100th time and snacking on chocolate. She is from Belgium, after all. And she has a membership community. So the Chopstick Stitching Squad membership will help knitters and crocheters gain the inspiration, confidence, and skills to turn their creativity into beautiful creations while broadening their crafting horizon by teaching them knitting and crochet techniques, as well as her practical know-how and experience, providing patterns and a tight-knit community of worldwide crafting friends to cheer you on. She's offering workshop attendees an exclusive 7-day trial, and you can claim yours at that link that's on the screen. It's programs.knittingwithchopsticks.com/squad 7-day trial. You need to claim that by June 1st. I'll also paste that link in the chat. All right, and the very last thing to talk about before we get started with the workshop, for folks who are knitters and crocheters, or if you're just a crocheter but you're in today's class, whichever, Hortense is hosting the Blossoming Blanket Crochet Along. So it's a unique blanket full of texture inspired by blossoming flowers. It's designed by 11 of your favorite crochet designers online today. A new blanket stripe is released every Tuesday and Friday, and it started last week on May 7th. So there's, I think, 3 of the stripes are out now. All right, and it's free. So the event details and sign up are at knittingwithchopsticks.com, and I will also include that link. And if you don't want to wait for the patterns to be released a couple times a week, you can get the whole ebook already, and it's a PDF, and I'll also include that link in the chat. All right, I think that is everything. I'm going to turn it over to Hortense. Welcome, Hortense.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction and everything. I'm going to share my screen to get started. I found the right buttons. And then I'm going to make it pretty because it's always better when it's pretty. Okay. So welcome to today's class about how to read knitting patterns. Now, why would you want to learn to read patterns? So if you have no idea how to get started, like when you see a pattern, should you start at row 1? How do you select your materials? Should you read through the entire pattern or dive in straight away? You're confused about all the symbols, all the different brackets and asterisks, and so all of that. You're frustrated by all the abbreviations that you can't make any sense of, or you're lost not knowing what half of the pattern information means, gauge, blocking. What the heck does all of that mean? If any of these resonate with you, you're in the right spot today. So hopefully you'll leave this training with the confidence to read any written pattern effortlessly so that you can make the knit gifts you want that look like the pattern pictures. So what are we going to learn today? First off, what you need to know when you're tackling a new pattern, how to decipher a pattern step by step, some concrete examples of a pattern walkthrough. And if you're catching this live, of course, I'm here for any questions. Now, this workshop is not for you. If you're an advanced knitter and you've been reading patterns for years, you're probably not going to learn anything new. If you are only looking to learn how to work with charts and graphs, unfortunately, that's not going to be covered today. And if you've decided that you can't read pattern and you aren't open-minded, I can't help you, basically. So if you're not willing to put in a tiny bit of effort to decipher patterns, I'm not sure I can help you a lot, but with a tiny bit of effort and today's class, you should be good to go. So I don't need to introduce myself anymore. Dana did an awesome job at that. Thank you. So we can go straight in. So before we start, no, well, it's not really before we start, but like first thing to do. I'm not going to start straight away with like the row by row instructions and like deciphering that. A pattern has a lot more information in it. Usually there's like a couple of pages of like overall information before the actual like row by row instructions. All that information is not just there to make you scroll. There's a lot of information that you actually need. We don't write things for nothing. So in today's first section of the workshop, I want to go over those different informations, what information you need, when you need it, what to do with it, and where to look for it, so that when you get to the actual row by row instructions, you know how to decipher them like automatically, and you know how to turn those into a project that looks like the pattern pictures, which is usually the goal. So first thing we need to do when we're starting a new project is make a few choices. You're going to have to select your pattern. You're going to have to get the right tools, and you're going to have to pick your size before you even make your first stitch. So let's look at those three main choices in more detail. So first, you need to select your pattern. So I highly recommend when you're going to like Ravelry or Etsy or Pinterest to find the perfect like first pattern to keep the following things in mind. For your first patterns, try to avoid patterns that have sizes. Sizes, like if a pattern is written for several sizes, it means there's a lot more information condensed, usually on the same number of pages, which means there's way more numbers than what you actually need, which means it can be very overwhelming and look very confusing. So try to start with patterns that only have one size. So you can get used to everything else and then add in the complexity of sizes later on. I recommend you go with a pattern that has like a photo or video tutorial that go with it. This way you can like visualize what's happening and you can like confirm that you understood the written instructions correctly and that you're on the right track. Some patterns and some designs have like funny constructions that can look very strange until they're all assembled and finished up, and having visual support to show you whatever you're doing is how it's supposed to look can be very helpful. I recommend you stick to stitches and techniques you already know. Of course, like you can figure out anything, but having too many new things at the same time is going to be confusing and overwhelming. So if you stick to a pattern that has like stitches and techniques you already know, and the only new thing is learning to read the instructions, it's going to be much easier for you to make the step of learning how to read patterns rather than adding in new stitches, new techniques, sizes, everything together tends to be overwhelming. And finally, I recommend you grab the printable PDF of the pattern so that you can like take notes. I'll show you how I like to take notes, how I like to write out repeats and things like that to make your life easier. But you can only do that with like a printable PDF. You can do it like digitally on the PDF, but not like on a free website. It's going to be hard. And then one final quick tip here. Stitch patterns are usually a very good exercise or like practice for reading patterns because they are usually very short. They don't include sizes and they're usually more detailed and have like photo tutorials or video tutorials to go along with them because most people who are looking at a stitch pattern, like it's a new stitch for them. So they will usually have more information. And when I mean like stitch pattern, I mean like a stitch repeat, not like an individual stitch, which is usually just like one abbreviation in knitting. So that's not going to be very helpful. So now that we like looked at patterns and you have my tips to decide what pattern you're going to go with, let's have a look at the materials you need to make said pattern. So in the first section, usually it's pretty much at the top, and a lot of designers even include this in like their pattern description. It's going to tell you like the materials. It's going to tell you which yarn the designer use or recommends, what's nice needle size, sorry, you'll need, and what type of needles, and any other items that you might need. Now, if we look at the yarn, designers will typically give you the yarn brand and line and the quantity you need. Usually they will tell you how many skeins they've used for like each size. So you don't need to use the exact yarn that the designer has, but there's a few things you need to keep in mind if you're like selecting your own yarn. First off, you need to look at the yarn weight. So when we say yarn weight, we mean the thickness of the yarn. We don't mean like the weight, like how heavy it is in grams or pounds. That is always confusing to me, but that's how it is. So the yarn weight thickness is classified in 7 categories, going from 0 to 6. And you want to make sure that the yarn weight you're going to use is the same as the one that's recommended by the pattern. If you're changing the yarn category completely, there's going to be like a lot of things happening with your design and a lot of adjustments needed. And that's like a whole other topic. So I recommend you stick to finding a substitute that matches the pattern, and looking at the yarn weight is the first step. So now how do you know what yarn weight your yarn is? If you look at your label, you usually have like a little symbol like this with a number and then like a word. You will notice that most things in crochet and knitting have different names to say the same thing. That also counts for yarn weights. So they have a lot of different names. If we look here at my table, that's from my yarn jargon cheat sheets that you can grab for free on my website. And they have like different tables for different conversions. There's a few of them we'll see in this workshop. I always have them in my project bag because it's so much easier. But anyway, yarn weights, you can see, for example, category 4, which is the most commonly used yarn, is a medium, but it's also called a worsted weight, an Afghan weight, Aran weight, or 10 ply. So this table is pretty convenient to, if you have a yarn label and there's no like number, but it just tells you like it's Aran weight, then you can see in this table, okay, that's like a 4 medium. But then we have us European, we like to be different and to do things even more complicated. And we don't use any numbers or any words to classify. Like we don't use this 6 or 7 category system. So European brands will only give you like a sample gauge information and like recommend a needle and hook size for their yarn, and not tell you what category that matches. Which can be very frustrating. But if you look at this table again, you have like the sample gauge. This table is crochet, but there's a knitting one. I don't know why I have the crochet one in this workshop, sorry, but it's pretty similar. I just have like a different number of stitches. You have the correct one in the cheat sheets. Cheat sheets are for both crochet and knitting, so you have everything. But if you look at this yarn and you see like the crochet hook was 6 or 7 mm, or the needle size is 8 or 9 mm. If you look at your table, that's going to be like a bulky weight, basically. So this is how you can, like, without having the classification, still match it to your table. Now, when you have your yarn weight and you pick a yarn that's like the correct yarn weight, you still need to figure out how much of it you need, basically. And unfortunately, yarns comes in all shapes and sizes. So if the pattern tells you you need 3 skeins of yarn A, it doesn't mean you're going to need 3 skeins of yarn B. Your skein size can be completely different. And even for like a very similar skein size, like 100-gram skeins for both, your yarn length can be very different. And what matters is your length of yarn. So you need to look at your yardage from your from the pattern skeins and calculate how many yards or meter you need total, and then convert that to whatever yarn you're going to use. So you need to do like a little we call it like a prorata rule, to make sure you have the right amount of yarn, or you're going to lose that like yarn chicken, and we don't want that. In any case, I would recommend you grab an extra skein, because everyone's tension is different, and even if you get the same gauge, somehow you can still use up more yarn or less yarn. And some skeins say they have 180 meters, but then they have like actually 170, and that might just make the difference in your project. So don't play too tight and have an extra skein, especially if you're ordering online. Your color and your yarn might get discontinued. Your color batches might be different later on. So that might be a problem. And one more thing to take into consideration is your yarn composition. So yarn can be made out of a lot of materials, and those can have a lot of impact on like the look and feel, texture, drape, softness of your project. So for like best results, to match your project to the project pictures as much as possible, I recommend you stick to the same composition, or like similar blends when you're working with blends. But if you go for something completely different, your project is going to look completely different and behave completely differently, and you might get disappointed. So that's like my main tips for yarn. Now, if we look at the needles that you need, again, knitting needles come in a lot of sizes, and sizes are named differently depending on where you are from or where your pattern is from. So US use a number system going from 0, the smallest size, to like 35 and more for like the bigger sizes. The metric system goes by millimeters, which is usually easy because usually it's not just a number that's written on your needles or on your project, but like the millimeter sign is there too. And then UK uses also numbers, but like in the reverse order. So that can be like super confusing. For example, UK 7 is a US 7, so that's easy. But a UK 9 is a US 5, and a US 5 is going to be, where is it? Sorry, a US 9, sorry, is also a UK 5, but sometimes they don't cross that way. Some of them are like not symmetrical. That makes sense. Like a UK 4 is not a US 4. It can be confusing. So just make sure you know which system you're working with, and so you know which size you need, and make sure you get the right size, basically. Now, even if you get like a specific size, always have like a few sizes up or down, because you might need to adjust depending on your gauge. We'll talk about gauge in a minute. But it's not because the pattern says you need 3mm needles and that's the only ones you have, that's going to work out, unfortunately. Now you can purchase needles in like different materials. You have wood, stainless steel, and plastic being the most common ones. Whatever material you choose is not going to impact your project directly. So it's up to your personal preference, and your pattern is not going to tell you like you need wooden needles for this one. Now, the designer might give you some tips. For example, if they're using a very slippery yarn like bamboo, they might recommend you stick to wooden needles, which are like wrappier and less slippery. But ultimately it's your personal preference. Now that we have like our materials sorted, let's look at the different sizes that you can make and how that information is given in the pattern. There's like two sort of categories of sizes. The first way you can have a pattern in different sizes is when the stitch repeat is given. So for like simpler shapes like squares, rectangles like blankets, scarves, washcloths, things like that, the designer might just give you the stitch repeat instead of like telling you exactly how many stitches for each size. It might tell you like if you want to adjust the size, you can add or remove a multiple of so many, or you need your total stitch count to be a multiple of this. Usually it's going to be a multiple of a set number, and then you'll have plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like for the edges, so that your like edges turn out pretty and as intended. So this tells you how to calculate how many stitches you need for your size, and with your gauge information, you can know if I want 20 centimeters, it means that many stitches, and then you round it up or down to meet the stitch multiple, basically. Now, the other way that sizes are given, and that's mostly for garments, it's going to tell you like it's your final project is going to end up this size, or it's going to fit this body. So there's two ways to give sizes for garments, which is first off, you can tell people the garment is designed to fit this body size. and then you just have to measure your body. Usually for like sweaters and cardigans and tops, you're going to measure your bust measurement, and then you can just match that straight up with the pattern sizes and see which one you need. The other option is to tell you what the finished garment size is going to be and how much ease has been like built in the design. So ease is how much bigger or smaller the garment is compared to your body. So ease can be either positive or negative. Positive ease is when it's loose and bigger than your body, and negative ease is when it's tighter than your body. And you need to like, basically you're going to stretch it out when you wear it. So it's going to be very form-fitting. Now, the further you are from 0, the looser or tighter your fit will be. So if you look at those pictures here, just to give you an idea, on the left side, you have a clear negative ease, and on the right side, you have a loose, comfy sweater, and that's like positive ease. You can also have like 0 ease, which means the sweater dimensions are exactly your body dimensions. Now, if the designer or the pattern doesn't tell you if it's positive or negative ease, you can usually assume that it's going to be positive ease. It's much more common than negative ease. And the photos will usually help you clarify in case of doubt whether it's positive or negative. If you see the picture, you can usually straight away say, okay, this one is positive ease or negative ease. Now, with this easy formula, you can calculate your like garment size. So you're going to take your body measurement. You're going to add up the ease that the pattern tells you it's designed for. And this is going to tell you the garment size you need to make. So if we look at an example, let's say here, this example, the sweater is designed in XS to 5XLs. And these are the garment measurements. Now, if you, and the ease is 5 to 10 centimeters, so that's 2 to 4 inches at the bust. Now, if you measure your bust and let's say you end up with 105 centimeters, and then you're going to add those 5 to 10 centimeters of ease. So you're going to look for the size that's 110 to 115 centimeters. So that's probably going to be a large, which is just 110. Now, if you want it to be even a bit looser than on the pictures, you could go for the XL size. And if you want it to be like a lot tighter than the pictures, you could go for the medium size. So the advantage with this technique is that the designer is giving you more freedom to define how fitting you want it, how you want it to fit on your own body compared to how they designed it. So it's like more flexible. It's a little bit more, there's like an extra step to choose your size, but it gives you more information and more flexibility on how it's going to fit and how it's designed so that you can make your choices the way you want it. And also it gives you like the final sweater measurements. So when you block it and you're done, you can make sure that you block it to the right measurements. When I tell you this sweater is designed to fit 100 centimeter bust, you don't know what the exact dimension of the sweater should be. So for blocking, it's also a bit more complicated unless the designer tells you at the blocking stage, but usually they don't. So I like to use option 2, and all of my patterns use option 2 in case you were wondering. Now that you know how to like select your size, let's have a look at how the information in the pattern is given so that you know what information to follow to actually make that size. So usually in the size section of the pattern, the notes will tell you how it's written, but most designers use the round parentheses to have the different informations for the different sizes. So we'll tell you, for example, like the sizes are noted XS and then like round parentheses, small, medium, large, and then all the sizes. Or you can group them in like separate groups of parentheses just to make it easier to break it up. So it's easier for you to look through the pattern and know what information to follow. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to follow whatever position inside the parentheses your size is in. So let's say you're making the XL. So that's the 4th number inside the bracket. Throughout the pattern, everywhere you have those round brackets with numbers, you're going to follow the 4th number. Everything else you can cross and ignore. You don't need it. So I like to print out my pattern and like literally cross off anything I don't need at this stage so that it's easier for me to not have information I don't need to look at. Now, the first size written here is usually going to be the smallest size, but sometimes it's also the size that the pattern has been made in, just to show you like that's the actual size that has been like knitted up and that the pictures show, and all the other sizes have been like calculated and like graded, but not the actual size the designer knitted up. So make sure you check out the size section and look at what size is positioned where inside the parentheses, so that you know which one to follow throughout the pattern. So if we look at a small example here, my pattern says like this is how I write my sizes. I'm going to make the large, which I've highlighted in pink. So wherever in the pattern, I'm going to follow like the third number inside the parentheses. So if it tells you to like crochet this many stitches or knit this many stitches, you need to follow that third number. And the yarn quantities in the material section is usually given in the same way. So this is for another pattern where we've broken up the sizes in like 2 groups. But if you need to follow like the 5XL size, which is the last one, you need to follow the numbers for the last one for your yarn quantities for every like colorway, just in the same way as you do like stitch counts, row counts, repeat numbers, anything like that is going to be given for different sizes in this way. So now that we have decided on our size, our materials, and our pattern, we can get started with stitching, right? Well, not just yet. There's one more thing you need to look at before you can actually dive in, and that's your gauge. You've probably heard that word before, and you probably very much want to ignore it. But I'm going to do like everyone else and tell you not to ignore it. Gauge can be super duper important if you want your project to end up the same size as intended in the design. You need to make sure you meet gauge. If you don't, you're going to get another size, but it's not only another size, but your proportions can be off. So sometimes I hear people like, oh, I just want to make it a size smaller, but the pattern is not available in that size. I'll just like go down a few needle sizes and have like a smaller gauge and I'll be fine. But your row and your stitch gauge might not have the same proportion in different, like than the designer, and then like your neckline and like any shapings might be off, which we don't want to. But to recap, for those of you who don't know what gauge is, so gauge is how many stitches and how many rows you should have using like your recommended yarn and needles in a 10 centimeter or 4-inch square. Now we usually traditionally use 10 centimeter or 4-inch for gauge indication, but some designers and some patterns might give you another like size for your gauge swatch. So make sure you check, but if nothing's indicated, if it just tells you gauge is 16 stitches by 12 rows, then it means that it's usually for 10 centimeter 4-inch square. So what this information means is that if the pattern tells you like your gauge is 16 stitches by 20 rows in stockinette, so if you knit 16 stitches and you knit like in stockinette, which is alternating knit and purl rows, for 20 rows, you should have a 10 centimeter 4-inch square. Now it's very important that you follow the stitch that's given in the pattern gauge information, because some stitches can be much tighter and looser than others. Even in knitting, even like garter stitch and stockinette stitch, there's a big difference in gauge, or there can be depending on how you knit. Now, why do you need a gauge swatch? So just like I said, it's to make sure that your project ends up the right size and that you meet the final project measurements. Now, of course, there's a few exceptions here. If you are making something and you really don't care if it's the exact same size or exact same proportions, for example, like a blanket, if it's like 5 centimeters bigger or smaller in one direction, it usually doesn't matter. So then you can get away with just following the yarn size and like needle size as the pattern and end up with something pretty. Now for anything that's more fitted, like garments, socks, anything like that, you do need to make a gauge swatch to be sure that it's going to fit properly. But it's not only about the size, it's also going to help you see what your like fabric is going to look like, how your project is going to turn out. And if you block it, and you should block it, it's also going to tell you like the final drape, any stretch, bleeding, things like that, that you would find. Unfortunately, I can't get into a whole workshop on gauge. and how to adjust it and how to make sure you meet it. We do have a deep dive workshop inside the Stitching Squad that you can look at if you grab that free trial. But for now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to move on. And I think Dana has a little intermission before we get into like examples.
Right, I'm gonna drop that link to the Stitching Squad trial in there in the chat again. And then I'm gonna chat a bit, yeah, about upcoming classes and a little note from an offer that we give to everybody who attends Fave Craft Studio Live courses. So our next upcoming class is this Learn to Sew a Heating Pad from a Sweatshirt, and that is with Angie Stocker of Highly Crafty. She's new to Fave Craft Studio Live. She's a comedian, so it should be entertaining. And that is coming up next week on Tuesday, May 21st, also at 11 a.m. Central. That's it for May classes. We are still finalizing our schedule for June, so stay tuned. The next class will be on June 11th. It's just, we're not sure what the topic is just yet. And then, oh my goodness, it's supposed to be an I Like Knitting. I apologize. I Like Knitting is offering folks an introductory rate of $5 US. I Like Knitting is a digital magazine that publishes 6 times a year. It's all online. And when you sign up for the magazine, you get access to all of the back issues. So it's a fun advantage to an entirely digital product. I Like Knitting's been publishing since 2014, so there's hundreds of patterns. They're all professionally tech edited and it's ads free because you're paying for a subscription. New members can get that $5 introductory price. If you want to sign up for I Like Crochet too, you can also do that since that's the slide that's up. I will drop the links to I Like Crochet and I Like Knitting digital magazine for that introductory $5 US offer in the chat. And that's all that I have to talk about. So I'll turn it back over to you, Hortense.
Thank you. I'm going to share the presentation again. We left off with, so we went through like all the sections that are before what I like to call like the actual pattern, like the row by row instructions. Now that you've read all of that and gone through all of that, you can start considering starting your project. When you're actually like stitching your project, there's 3 sections that you are going to refer to regularly, which is the abbreviation sections, the note sections, and any like special stitches and repeated patterns. These 3 sections really serve as like a key and a reference for you to decipher the instructions. I like to have a quick look through them, so it gives me an idea of like the level of the pattern, what kind of stitches and techniques to expect, and if it feels like I can do this or not. If there's like a lot of things that I've never heard of, it's probably going to be a bit hard. If I'm comfortable with most of them, but there's like a few new abbreviations or like new stitches, then it's a perfect opportunity pattern for me to learn something new without getting completely overwhelmed. So that's one way you can gauge like the level of the pattern. Pattern levels are given with like only 4 levels: beginner, intermediate, beginner, easy, intermediate, and advanced, which is very confusing because most people commonly say a pattern is easy when it's beginner, or like are looking for beginner patterns when they're typing in like easy pattern. So like a lot of designers will tell you their pattern is easy while it's beginner, just so you can find it when you type in easy patterns. So those terms get mixed up, and like 4 categories of level is usually not enough for having a real idea of how easy or difficult it's going to be for you. And also depending on what kind of projects you've done before, how comfortable you are with some techniques or others, it might be very different. So that's one way you can gauge it for yourself. Now, if we look at the first of those 3 sections, which is the abbreviations, so they usually have their own sections. They are very standard, especially in knitting. The Yarn Craft Council has like a complete list. My cheat sheets have like a short list of the most common ones and the ones you'll need for like beginner to easy level patterns. And you can just refer to those. I have never encountered a pattern that's not following the same standard abbreviations unless it's like in another language. So you'll get used to them pretty quickly. The only difference is some people use capital letters, some people small letters, but mean the same thing. So it's not like a huge problem. Patterns in like magazines or like big websites might not have the abbreviation listed in every pattern, but just like once for the issue or even like once on the website, and they'll just tell you like it's always the same. So you might need to look it up a little bit if you're working from one of those patterns and can't find it. But usually if you just Google it, you'll find the abbreviation very quickly. Now the notes section, that's probably the most important section in your pattern. And this is where the designer will explain how to read their specific pattern instructions. Knitting patterns, thankfully, are much more standardized than crochet patterns. So it's a bit less important here. But this is the section where we tell you how to read like the different types of brackets, any asterisks, any other like specific notations we're using, how we're showing you like the final stitch count at the end of the row of round. Usually we use like the pointy brackets or the round brackets. I don't like to use the round brackets because that's what I use for different sizes. So it can get confusing for me, but a lot of people do, and it's pretty standard, so it's good to know. So definitely read through this note section carefully before you start stitching. It's gonna help you avoid a lot of mistakes and frogging and a lot of questions. And then you have the special stitches and repeated patterns section. So anything that's not a very basic stitch should be defined here. So the basic knit stitches are like the knit stitch, the purl stitch. Usually we'll consider stockinette and garter stitch as basic enough that you don't need to explain it. Depending on the level of the pattern, there might be other stitches that are considered basic. Like if you're at an advanced level pattern, the designer might not detail how to make, I don't know, the seed stitch or things like that are quite common. Now, if there's something in there in the pattern that's you don't know what it is and it's not prepared here, you can just look it up in Google. Usually you'll find a video tutorial for it or like written explanations, and it's like it just means it's something that's pretty standard and common. So no need to panic. Now, if the designer use a specific repeat inside their project and they don't want to like write it up every time it comes back, they'll tell you like this is the repeat, and then they give it a name. For example, like the flower stitch or the flower repeat, and then it's like a 10-row repeat over 20 stitches, and that's used like throughout the garment. And then they'll tell you like make 5 repeats of the flower repeat, and you just go back to the repeated patterns section to figure out what exactly that means, like what the exact rows and stitches are. But this way, the designer doesn't have to like repeat the same thing over and over, and you'll get used to it too. If you're making a bigger project and the same repeat comes back over and over, you'll probably memorized it and won't need to read through it again. While if we give you like the exact stitches every time, you might need to go through it and be like, oh, but this is just the same that I've been doing 5 times. Why don't you just tell me just do the same? So there's a bit of like both. Some people like having it repeated, spelled out, so they don't have to go back to the repeated section. Other people like to know, okay, it's the same repeat, and then go back if they need it. So it's a bit of a personal preference on the designer side and on the reader side, but that's how it's noted basically. Now, once you've gone through these 3 sections, now you're finally ready to get stitching. There's a few steps I like to take to make sure that I'm not like rushing through things and making mistakes and getting panicked and overwhelmed. I like to break things down into small manageable pieces. I call this like the snail approach, just like slow and steady. Step 1, buy your printable PDF so you can take notes, highlight your size, cross off anything that's not related to you, whether that's like all the different numbers for the different sizes, whether that's like an entire section that's only for specific sizes and that's not your size, anything like that, just like cross it off. Crossing off things is very like rewarding. I don't know. I like to make checklists and cross them off, so I like to cross off things. Anyway, you can always reprint your pattern if you want to make another size later. If you don't want to print it out and you want to do this digitally, there's a lot of like note applications and like softwares where you can do this. write out any repeats. So anytime the pattern tells you to repeat something, I like to write it out. I won't write out like the whole instructions 5 times, for example, but I will write out like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will write those 4 numbers 5 times. So anytime I finish the repeat or like finish the row, I can cross it off and then I know exactly where I'm at, and I don't need a row counter, or I don't need to read my work and figure it out. Those are both good options when you get more used to repeats and to like working off a pattern and figuring out where you left off or where you're at. But writing things out is very helpful. Also, if you have like rows or rounds that have a lot of different blocks to it, kind of like repeat those 5 stitches 5 times and then repeat those other 5 stitches 10 times, things like that. It can be helpful to write those out too and cross them off so you can keep track. Take things 1 row at a time. So don't try to read through all the pattern and like visualize and understand everything in detail before you get started, because you'll probably just get overwhelmed. It's going to make much more sense when you're at that step to figure out what you need to do. It can be tempting to like read through the whole thing. It's a bit of a personality thing. Some people like to read all of it, others don't. I usually don't, otherwise I would not have made half of the things I did. So it's usually much easier than you think. And if you're at that stage, that step, it's gonna be much easier to make sense of it than before you have even started. If you don't know something, just look it up. Most knitting is very old, so most things have been done over and over again, and you'll find a YouTube tutorial or like Google it for whatever stitch or technique. They're all explained out there. And then I recommend you check your work. So after each like round or row or each repeat or like each block of stitches, double check that you have the right count and that you don't see any mistakes. The sooner you catch a mistake, the easier it is to fix. Don't hesitate to frog or undo a few stitches or a few rows to fix things, especially if you drop the stitch. If you drop the stitch and don't fix it, it's just going to unravel everything. So that's not an option. Now, if you have a stitch count error before you frog and you undo whatever you've done, double check. Usually my counting is wrong and my stitches are right. So I have frogged a lot of things for nothing, which is very stupid. So make sure you double count, like count at least that you have the same stitch count twice before you frog. And also check that the pattern stitch count makes sense. So when you see like the row instruction, count the actual stitches inside the instruction and make sure that tallies up to the total that's indicated. Unfortunately, everyone makes mistakes, even designers and tech editors and testers, and some stitch counts errors tend to slip into patterns more easily than we'd like. And don't hesitate to reach out to the designer if you're unsure. We usually are very happy when someone finds the mistakes and helps us fix it and avoid having anyone else stumble on it. So don't think you're bothering us or that we're like unavailable for help and like for double checking things. I don't think anyone's gonna get offended or mad because you told them there might be a mistake. It's just helping out everyone, basically. And finally, mark your progress. So when you work on something, usually you can't finish it, especially when it's knitting and it takes a bit more time. Usually you're going to have to put it down and then get back to it. Sometimes you think you're going to put it down for like half an hour and get back to it, and then it's 5 days later because you have tiny toddlers like I do, and then you have no idea where you're at. So anytime you sit down, like you put it down, I like to write on my pattern the date and like a line or a cross or an arrow where I stopped. I highly recommend adding the date, because if you just do like a symbol and then you have like 5 arrows in your pattern and you don't remember which one is the last one, it can get confusing, especially when you have to go back to like repeated sections and things like that. But you can use like other options, or like to strike through anything you've done, to use like a post-it note that you can move. You have like those little arrow post-it notes that you can move. You can use like a ruler, but rulers don't stick to the paper if you're moving, and you can also do this like digitally. The app, for example, Knit Companion, is designed for that. I haven't used it personally, but I've heard good things about it. So definitely check it out if you're more like a digital knitter. And then finally, learn to read your project. So by reading your project, I mean like being able from looking at your project to tell how many stitches you've done, how many rows you've done, how many repeats. Unfortunately, there's no magic trick for learning this. It's a bit of time and practice and patience, but it's going to be so helpful with time if you know like, okay, this is 5 rows of stockinette. This is like 2 repeats. This is what a decrease looks like. This is what an increase looks like. Things like that, because then you don't need to keep track of everything. You can just look where you're at. Okay, I made 5 repeats already. I need to make 6. I just make 1 more, things like that. So it's good to make like a conscious effort to do it in the beginning so that it comes to you quicker than just having it like unconsciously developing, so that you can like know where you're at, know your repeats, know what you're doing much faster than you would if you didn't like make it an exercise with your first patterns. So now let's dive into like practical examples of how all of this comes together. My first example here is a simple scarf. It doesn't have any sizes, so that's like an easy first pattern kind of thing. The instructions will always start by telling you how many stitches you need to cast on. So it tells you here, like I've bolded like the actual pattern instruction, and like anything else is my explanation around it. So the pattern tells you cast on 43 stitches or a multiple of 4 plus 3. So here I'm using the size technique of giving you the stitch multiple. So if you want to make it wider or narrower, you can adjust that yourself. It tells you it's a multiple of 4 plus 3. So it means 40 is a multiple of 4. And then we have those plus 3 for the edges. So you could use 47 or like 39. Basically, you can add or remove as many multiples of 4 as you want. Then row 1 tells you row 1. So the star, knit 3, purl 1, row star, repeat until the last 3 stitches, knit 3. So here the star, if you look at the note section, it's going to tell you that this whatever is in between stars needs to be repeated. And it's going to be repeated at the number of times it's indicated or until the end of the row, basically. So here we're going to repeat those 4 stitches, knit 3, purl 1, until we only have 3 stitches left on our right needle, and then we're going to knit the last 3 ones. Then row 2 is approximately the same. It's starting with knit 1, purl 1, and then you have those repeats in the star again, which is knit 3, purl 1, and you're going to repeat that until the last stitch, which you're going to knit. So every time you have like the knit or purl symbol and the number after it, which tells you how many stitches you need to make. So that's like a very simple pattern. Now, if we look at a bit more advanced pattern, well, at least a pattern that has like different sizes, and then we can see how that comes into the instructions. We're going to look at this salt and pepper cardigan, which is like a simple cardigan I've designed. The pattern tells you like the sizes are noted throughout the pattern in the following way. And then you have XS and then the round parentheses and all the other sizes. And let's say we're going to make a medium. Now, medium is the second size inside the parentheses. So that's the number I need to follow throughout the pattern. If I look at my first instruction, it's going to tell you with your 3.75 mm or US 5 needles, you need to cast down this many stitches. Now, I have those round parentheses with a lot of numbers. So I know I need to follow the second one inside the parentheses, which in this case is 200. So I'm going to cast on 200 stitches with my needles. And then move to the next instruction and ignore all the other numbers. Now it's telling me it's using the square brackets. So if I look at the note section for this pattern, it tells me that the square brackets indicate whatever you need to repeat. So what's inside the back brackets is going to be repeated across the row or the number of time indicated. It also tells me that the final stitch count at the end of the row is indicated with those like pointy arrows. So here I'm going to have knit 1, purl 1, and it's telling me to repeat that across for 4 centimeters or 1.5 inch. So I'm not only telling you to repeat it across the row, but also to repeat that row for 4 centimeters. So we like to condense things in knitting, especially, and instead of using like how many rows you need to do, we often give measurements. Be aware those are blocked measurements because it's your blocked gauge that you have in your pattern. So if there's a big difference between your blocked and unblocked gauge, make sure you take that into account. But we like to give you like the length, because like counting all those rows can be very annoying, especially when you have like bigger sections. Like the next section is like knit and stockinette stitch until total length is 42 centimeters. So I don't want to count how many rows are in 42 centimeters, probably like 200 something. So to make it easier, I'm just going to tell you like the dimension, and you can just like measure it up and know until where you should go. Now you can see here, I don't have any like pointy brackets with a stitch count at the end of my instructions. That means that my stitch count doesn't change from one row to the next. So there's no increase or decrease here. When your stitch count is constant, we're not giving it anymore. We only tell you the new stitch count when it's changing, so that we avoid having, well, even more numbers on the page, and only have numbers when they're actually necessary and they change, just to try to simplify. Here, I'm telling you to do the stockinette stitch, and either I have defined it in the special stitches, but stockinette is also a very common stitch. So if you don't know what it is, you can look it up in Google, but it's just like knitting on the right side and purling on the wrong side for projects that are worked in rows, or like knitting in the round for projects in the round. It's just knit, 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 knit. So that's very common. Now, the next block of instruction tells you to make the decreases for the neck shaping. We're going to keep working in stockinette, but we're going to decrease on both sides of the neck. And then I have this, I think it's called a semicolon in English, like the 2 points, to tell you that's this, the next instruction is how this is defined. I have the square brackets again. And then in there, I have a decrease row, which is knit two together, and then knit until the last 4 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 2. And that decrease row is followed by 3 rows in stockinette. And this whole thing, those whole 4 rows are repeated 5 times. So you need to make 4 times 5, 20 rows total. And you're going to end up with 190 stitches because you've decreased 5 times. This is one of the questions I get a lot. In knitting, we like to use the square brackets to indicate repeats for even inside a row, or like for a set of rows. Usually in crochet, if you have like a set of row that's repeated, we're going to number the rows and tell you like row 1 to 5, and then repeat row 1 to 5 so many times. It's a bit of a different like common practice. It's not that you can't do it one way or the other for the other crafts, but it's just habits, which I keep fighting over with my tech editor, which is more of a crocheter. But if you do both crafts, you'll notice this difference. Then we have next instruction. That's just like a new decrease row. Oh, sorry, that's like just explaining inside whatever I already told you. So you can like write out those repeats like I recommended. So those 4 rows times 5, you could write it 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, so that you can cross them off. Now, another example that I wanted to show you is this bonbon cardigan, because it has something in there that tripped me up a lot, which is when we're casting off some stitches. So if we go straight to that part of the instructions, it's going to tell you work 3 stitches in ribbing pattern. So the ribbing pattern is probably defined earlier, and it's just a knit 1, purl 1 in this case. In knitting, we like to use stitch patterns a lot and not have every stitch spelled out, because you usually have a lot more stitches than in crochet and a lot more rows. So if you can just like refer to them with a name, it's much easier. And then I have those stars again, which is how my pattern repeat is indicated for this one. It's going to tell you cast off 2 stitches and then work 4 stitches in ribbing pattern. So you're going to knit the 3 stitches, and then to cast off 2 stitches, you're going to knit 2 more stitches and slip the second one over the first one, then knit 1 more stitch and slip that one over the first one. So you're going to end up with 4 stitches before your cast off stitches. And you're going to repeat that however many times is indicated. And then it tells you to work a certain number of stitches in ribbing pattern. to finish off your row. So you finish off your instructions. One more thing I wanted to note here is that I don't have an example here, but if my row counts are given, like we do a lot in crochet, if I'm telling you like work row 3 to 5 in this repeat, 3 to 5 is actually 4 rows, not 3. 5, 6, 7, 8, that's 4. I get tripped by this a lot. So I just wanted to make sure I highlighted here in case you come up with that. And then I have a final example for you where I want to show you how things are written when some part of the instructions are not applicable to your size. We usually use either like a dash symbol or like a big capital X to indicate like this is not applicable for this size, but we're not just removing those. So even if my section says for sizes large to 5XL only, I'm still giving the spots to all the sizes so that if you need to follow the fourth number inside the first set of parentheses, it's still going to be the fourth number inside the first parentheses. If I were to remove those symbols because I don't need it for these sizes, my numbers would not be in the same spot for the same size as throughout the whole pattern, which would be more confusing for everyone. So that's why we do this. So if you see some X's or some dashes, it just means it's not applicable for those sizes, but you can still refer to the same spot inside the parentheses for your instructions. And that's what I had for you today. I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Just froze for a second on my own screen. Pardon me. We have 5 great questions, and we only have a couple minutes left. So if we go a little bit over, this is great. If we go a little bit over, folks can always watch the recording if you have to go. So first question we have, Michelle was asking, are people as concerned with dye lot these days?
Probably not as much as they should. Depending on the brands, there can be quite a variation. I have a very pretty sage blanket that's not the same color throughout, and I only noticed it when I put it in the sun. So you should look at it. It still makes a difference, even though it's like much more industrial than it used to be, and industry has gone a lot, like much farther. Depending on the brands and how, I don't know, technically, professionally advanced they are, it might make a big difference. And for anything that's like hand dyed, definitely makes a difference, of course.
Great. Lori is asking, can you add lower weight yarns together to make a higher weight? For example, a 2-weight yarn and a 4-weight yarn. Does that make a 6-weight?
So yes and no. So yes to the first part, you can add them up to make bigger yarns, but that's not how you do it. So actually every size is like double the previous one. So 2 threads of size 1 makes a size 2, 2 threads of size 2 makes a size 3, 2 threads of size 3 makes a size 4, and so on.
Oh, great. All right. And then if I mispronounce the name, I'm so sorry. Adafunka is asking, to knit patterns with cables is difficult. How can they adapt a pattern to the required measurement?
So you need like using circular needles is difficult. What does you mean like a cable stitch, or like a circular needle that has a cable? That's where I get confused.
That's a good question. Maybe we can circle back. I assumed the cable stitch, but
can you repeat the question then with the cable stitch?
Sure. To knit patterns with cable is difficult for me. How can I adapt a pattern to a required measurement?
So your cable is gonna be tighter than your normal gauge. So what I would do is I would make a swatch with the cable, see how wide that is, and then see how many stitches you need with your like other stitch gauge that you want to use, and then convert it that way. But you're gonna have to do some math.
Hey, 2 more questions. Nancy's asking, is there a standard size for baby blankets? Can they be made bigger, wider, and longer?
So there's a lot of like standard-ish sizes, like common sizes, but there's no rule. anyone can call any size a baby blanket, unfortunately. And depending on the stitch repeats, you like when I design a blanket, I try to grade it in like 8 or 9 sizes. And I always have a table with whatever size that ends up with. And I have a standard table that I always refer to and that I start off with. But if I have like big repeats, it might end up like an inch or two bigger or smaller than the actual standard size just to fit my repeats. So you should look at every pattern, whatever they call a baby size.
Right. And then the last, actually, wait, I have 2 more questions. Allison's asking, how do you know how long to knit if the instructions are a blocked measurement? What do I look for in the gauge to know how long it is? For example, is 25 inches.
So for example, you should make your gauge and measure it before blocking, seeing how many rows you have in 10 centimeters. Then you block it and you see how many rows you have now. And then you can have like the proportions. So for example, if it grows by one row becomes 0.8 rows, you can do your 25 centimeters times 1.2 and then see how many, like 0.8 to see how many centimeters you need before blocking. It's like a pro rata rule again. There's a lot of pro rata rules in knitting. But basically, if you take your blocks before blocking and after blocking and you see like the relation between those, you can apply the same relation to whatever dimension to calculate your unblocked dimension.
Great. Allison says that makes sense. Thanks.
Awesome.
All right. And then the last question, Linda's asking if we see the X in the pattern, do we just keep knitting as per the previous instruction?
So the X just means that this instruction is not applicable for that size. So if your size is the size where there's an X, you just skip it and you just go to the next instruction. But usually if it's like a complete section that's not applicable for your size, it's going to tell you like for this size, follow that block, and then otherwise skip to the rest.
All right, well, that's it for questions. I will share my screen one last time. Thank you again so much, Hortense, for teaching today. Okay, I've got a lot of tabs covering things. Hopefully that's not the case on other people's screens. If folks have any questions, oh, good. If folks have any questions about Favecraft Studio Live, our classes in general, Zoom questions, anything like that, you can reach out to me directly at dneeld@primecp.com. And if you aren't following Hortense already, her social media handles are on the screen here, Knitting with Chopsticks on Pinterest, Instagram, Facebook. And sign up, get that free trial for the Chopsticks Stitching Squad. And a few folks had gauge related questions, so you can watch that presentation during your 7-day trial if you would like. And I think that, oh, and then there's also the crochet along. So you'll get all those links in our recap email tomorrow, and they'll be in the descriptions on Favecrafts and on YouTube as well. All right. Thank you again so much, Hortense, for teaching today's class.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.